welcome and thanks for coming to what I think will be a fascinating discussion. I'm Isaac Diwan. I'll be chairing this, trying to animate the debate. We have a wonderful panel today. We are starting with on my right, we have Mr. Jalloul Ayed. Ayed. Thank you. Jalloul Ayed, who was Minister of Finance in Tunisia during the first post-revolution government, an investment banker, and I must say also a composer of symphonies. And so very glad that you came for literally 24 hours with us. On my left I have Jihad Az'our, who also was the Minister of Finance in Lebanon during difficult periods, and is now with Booz in the Gulf, one of the senior managers there. He keeps a look at the Gulf and the Middle East from there. And then Samir Hulaileh, who was also a minister. I say ministers because this is a public policy school that produces a lot of ministers. Minister of Government Affairs, I think. But you had also various roles in the Palestinian administration, and also, like our two other guests, very active in the private sector. I must say this discussion will continue till 1:30. It was misadvertised in some places, so I hope you can stay with us all the way. It is advertised as after the revolutions. Rethinking economic growth in the Middle East. I mean, clearly the Middle East right now is in the middle of, or at least many of the countries that saw uprisings and revolutions are in the middle of a political reconstruction, which is costly to the economy in many cases. It also opened new opportunities. So these are really the two aspects of our discussions today. There's the short-term difficulties of the economy and the long-term possibilities that hopefully these political transformations will allow, will open up over time, but also the difficult political reconstruction, which may be taxing to the economy, but can also open up possibilities. So we want to really have to hear from you a little bit what is happening on the ground, to what extent new possibilities are at least profiling themselves on the horizon, and how do you see the evolution in the future? Are there new opportunities? Do you see the need for more proactive policies to make those happen? Is it likely to happen? Can one expect politicians in these tumultuous times to rise to the occasions? Or is it possible that they will have to respond to more popular demands that by themselves will create more energy, more momentum for the economy? So let me open it up on this note. Let's have perhaps a first round where you focus on the short-term challenges, and then we will move the discussion to the medium and long-term challenges. We will try to keep this to maybe half an hour to really have a dynamic Q&A. I see lots of people around that have specific questions. Jalloul, shall I start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Let me start by saying that I never meant to become Minister of Finance. It was imposed on me. I was sitting in my office in London one day, working on different files, but very much concerned about what was happening back home. And I got a phone call from the Prime Minister saying that the Prime Minister would be calling me. Didn't know what it was about, so he did call. Very late, I was walking back to the metro station, as I do every day, and I got a phone call from the Prime Minister of Tunisia at the time, saying, Mr. Ayed, congratulations, the Minister of Finance of Tunisia. And so the first thing that came to mind, a stupid question, is when should I be there? He said tomorrow morning, because it was very much urgent. And it was, in fact, interesting because I left Tunisia 24 years earlier when Ben Ali took power, dictator, and was asked to come back when he left. So for the 24 years I was away, still following what was happening in my country, but never really intended to go back, and certainly not to go back in government. It was a fascinating experience, I must say. And so imagine when I went back there, the situation was obviously extremely topsy-turvy. I mean, there was a revolution. And you know, revolution is like giving birth. It hurts, but it's beautiful. And so, but that's not what I felt, quite frankly, when I started working as Minister of Finance. You know, there were thousands of people in front of my office, because my office happened to be at this place, a government place called Kasbah. And all demonstrations took place there. So trying to, you know, I mean, imagine trying to work in that environment. But you had to, you had to take things as they come and do whatever you can to help the country. The nice thing about our government, this by the way was the second transitional government. So I served in two governments in over 11 months or so. Was that it was mostly composed by technocrats. So let me start by saying that this is important. To have a government that is composed by technocrats, they only have one thing in mind, which is to serve the country. They did not have any political affiliations, we didn't have any agenda or any political agenda. In fact, we were precluded from even participating in the elections. So day in and day out, and you know, day in and day out, we were thinking about just doing one thing: serving the interests, the supreme interest of the country, and it's important to keep that in mind, because I will be talking about the government that we have today, which is a political government, and the situation is very different, particularly when we talk about the economy. So we had to do what we had to do. Obviously, I had to learn, and I had to learn very, very fast. But obviously, being, you know, I mean, coming from a financial background, I didn't find it very, very difficult to start making decisions. In fact, very, very quickly. And what really struck me at the time is how much my country was behind compared to when I left it, particularly in certain sectors such as the financial sector, the working of the administration and of the central government. And I immediately felt that the future of Tunisia lies first and foremost on the reforms that needed to be carried out. And I did, in fact, initiate a lot of reforms. For example, the reform of microfinance. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but microfinance is extremely important for countries that, you know, such as Tunisia. And the way I explain it is usually by saying every small loan that you give is a job that you create. More often than not, it's more than one job. It's 2 jobs or 3 jobs. So the first reform that I initiated as Minister of Finance was to conduct a complete overhaul of the microfinance. The second reform that I felt could not wait is private equity. And I will explain that, and obviously, you know, we can address that later if you have any questions. Have to go fast. Why private equity? Because in a country such as Tunisia, and by the way, this is very similar, I would say, across the region, right? You take a look at the economy and you realize that 80%, sometimes even more than 80%, of the economic fabric in those countries is composed of SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And then you hear people saying that the problem of SMEs is that they don't have access to bank finance, when in fact that is not the right problem. At least that's not the way you should pose the problem. The problem is that they don't have access to an equity market or a capital market. Because as you all know, I mean, you have to have capital before you could go to your banker to raise financing. And in Tunisia, we really didn't have an equity market. And so that is something that really needed to be done. Because remember, the revolution in Tunisia was carried out by young Tunisians, most of them graduates, who didn't find a job, some of them for 10 years. Right? So we had to create jobs. And if you want to create jobs, then you have to take care of the economy. And you have to take care of the operators in the economy, meaning, you know, the small, medium-sized enterprises, and of course the large, the large groups, the large companies, and the public sector. So we did that. And I still remember, you know, talking to some experts coming out of the World Bank and some other agencies, and they were telling us impossible. You cannot do it in 4 months or 6 months. We did it. We did it, and because we knew what had to be done, and we just, you know, went on with the job, and that was done. Now, what they're doing with it now is a different story. And so many other things. So imagine in a situation where there is a great deal of, where there was sort of turmoil in the country, demonstrations every day, and I was telling my guys, this is the priority, because I knew that to fix the problem and to fix the economy, you had to conduct and you had to initiate reforms in the country, and I still believe that. It's not always sequential. In other words, you don't do it and then hope for things to happen. More often than not, you do it at the same time. And some reforms take a much longer period of time than what I just mentioned. For example, microfinance, private equity, setting the proper framework for PPP, or public-private partnership, which I think we will be talking about, because this is extremely important in redefining the role of the government. And some reforms take time. For example, the reform of the financial system. Would you imagine that in a country such as Tunisia, where we have to embark on large-scale projects, that need financing, we all know that commercial banks should not be financing long-term assets, right? So you have to have capital markets, and it's only through the capital markets that you arrange for medium to long-term obligations, so that you can finance the projects, particularly in infrastructure, which is the backbone of any economy. That will take a little longer. That may take 3 years, 4 years, but you have to start now. You have to start now, because that cannot wait. And so that is just giving you some ideas about some of the challenges that we had to face. Very, very small, but very, very important. And so the real lesson, I would say, is that in a transitional phase, because as you know, after a revolution there is a transition. There is a first transition, which is called a transitional phase, going from a technocratic government to an elected government, or to a government which is appointed by an elected body, which in the case of Tunisia is the Constitutional Assembly. And there are challenges when you move from a technocratic government, and we think we have done a very good job. We've been successful in the sense that the objective was to hold the first free and democratic elections in the country, something that we've done for the first time in the history of the country. So we've been successful, but that's not the end of the story. Okay. After that first transitional government, by the way, yesterday we have celebrated, if I can use this word, the first anniversary of those elections. That was the 23rd of October. Then we passed on the baton to a politically appointed government. And the difference between a technocratic government, as I said earlier, which is really motivated only to serve the country and the interests of the country, when you have a political government, which is what we've had over the last year, the priority is a little different. I would even say that it is very different, in the sense that a political government, by definition, is more concerned about the next elections than about initiating some of the reforms that I shared with you. Okay, and that is a huge issue, I think, and I think we can talk about that later. The difference between a political government which is running the country in a transitional period is that they may not and do not put their priorities right, which is, in other words, priorities that are in line with the priorities of the country, meaning taking care of the economy, taking care of social problems, and more importantly, carrying out the reforms that are needed if you were to set forth a strong basis for the economy to grow again and to resume growth and to resume development.
Thank you. I think you set the stage very nicely. I just want to say there are plenty of chairs next door and a lot of room here, so if you're energetic, you may want to get yourself a chair. Thank you for setting the stage. Let me move to you, Jihad, and let's try to take it forward. Two questions. First of all, is there a risk of a meltdown? If not, can we expect change to happen even during this transitional period? Are politicians going to feel compelled to start a few reforms even before we have solid, proactive governments in place?
Well, thank you. Bon appetit, first of all. In fact, it's very easy. Well, it's much easier to analyze the past or to predict the future than to read the present. And therefore, your question is very difficult to answer. what one could say, or the few takeaways, is we are at the end of the second year of what we call the post-Arab Spring. And then if we look at the macro situation, we could say the following. We are, like in any country going through political transition, we're witnessing a J curve, or we're witnessing a decline in the economic indicators, being the level of growth that went down from an average 5% to 2.5% on average in all countries who went into political transitions. We saw a deterioration in public finance, as well as also in capital flows and the level of reserves of the central banks. However, at the end of 2012, we could expect that 2013 will be a year of recovery. One should also keep in mind that this political transition that is taking place came at a time when the global economy, or countries that are affecting the Middle East, are not doing well. Europe is an important economic partner, mainly for countries who are going through political transition, and hence the fact that Europe is not doing well economically is affecting those countries, in addition to the slowdown globally. Therefore, no, there is no risk of meltdown. The situation is not as good as it was prior to the blossom of what we call the Arab Spring, and a kind of an international safety net, a combination between support from GCC countries, as well as also involvement of the international community. Mind you that 3 of the 5 Arab transitioning countries went into program with the IMF recently, and there are negotiations or active negotiation with Egypt, and maybe Tunisia could next year also initiate some talk with the fund to have program, and hence to stabilize the macro situation. The second takeaway is the political transition is taking more time than expected, and therefore today the focus is on politics much more than on economic or social issues. If you go to those countries, the debate is on the type of constitution, the rights of the various political parties, the type of representation. You didn't see enough space in the public debate about, social issues, economic issues, those issues that were in fact the major factor in the change that took place. I expect that in 2013 we will see more of a discussion on the economic issues, the new economic model, as well as also how the government is going to address the long-lasting structural reforms needed in those countries. The third takeaway is the elite that usually generates thoughts is not active yet in bringing up new ideas about what should be the economic model in those countries, and how we can bring up this political transformation into something that is really worthwhile fighting for. And I think this is where the challenge is today, is what type of economy those countries should aim at building, what are the opportunities that need to be grasped, how about the long-lasting challenges and structural reforms that were needed. Are we better equipped to do them or to address those structural reforms or not? The last point, I think, is the way you address the transformation. Okay? Definitely, few were expecting this to happen, and less were prepared to conduct this change. And therefore, when the change took place, and especially it was popular, youth-based, using modern technologies, very few were equipped, in fact, to embrace this transformation and to provide, in fact, the right conduit for this. To compare with other political transitions, let's take, Europe in late 80s, we saw immediately the European community putting in place framework to help those countries, be it on the financial side, on the reform, as well as also providing technical assistance. In the case of the Arab Spring, we saw a major announcement that took place in Deauville in 2011, where $80 billion of promises were put on the table during the G8 meeting. but didn't translate really into something concrete. And we didn't see a framework of support to those countries. And this is, in fact, was left to individual initiatives. And the proof is now we're seeing Gulf countries providing on bilateral basis support without real framework. We didn't see the forces that made change involved in the making of the future of those countries. At the end of the day, the youth of those countries were, at the forefront of this transformation. We're not seeing them in the debate today. We're seeing, all political parties going back, which is good in a sense that, those political parties are working together to reach consensus that leads to some compromise on both sides. But I think there are forces within those nations that need to be more involved in shaping up the future. And therefore, let me venture a bit on the future, and then I will stop here. I'm sure during the discussion we will go back to those issues. The road ahead. The road ahead, well, it's professional deformation. As a consultant, I have to come up with some recommendations or suggestions. I think we need a citizen-centric approach to address the transformation agenda in the region. We cannot ignore that at the end of the day, citizens who are the initiator of this change were asking for some concrete changes, and they had some specific issues. I'm not going to list them, we all know them. The way I see it, I see it into two stages approach, but need to be activated immediately. The first one is the right transition to stability, the rapid response initiatives. As I said, the transformation was mainly politically driven, left some of the economic and social issues that were there before and get compounded with the political transition unaddressed. And I'm sure that next year, even if we're going to see a recovery, the street is going to ask for more from government. And the risk is that the government will provide the old recipes, i.e. additional subsidy, additional patronizing policies, and more of the state. Therefore, I think the transition to stability is going to be very important, and the approach of addressing the economic priorities, the social priorities, as well as also to establish some confidence-building mechanisms at the governance level, at the role of the state in the economy, as well as also on launching or spearheading some of the initiatives that the previous speaker mentioned. The second dimension is, I think, the new economic governance model that has three elements. One, a new vision or dream for those countries and for the region. This dream has to address some key questions. How to bring a sustainable level of growth that exceeds 5 to 7% in order to address the long-lasting social and developmental issues. Where the growth is going to come from. What type of economic paradigm, be it in terms of the way the economy is organized or in terms of exchange, trade services, and capital flows, in order to reach a sustainable level of 5 to 7% of growth. Otherwise, this transformation will not provide the solution that people are asking for. Second is how the economy is going to function. We had in the past strong states involved in not only governing the economy but also in the economic production, and therefore how to remove the state from this job, because this function brought with itself a lot of clientelism and in fact helped raise a group of business leaders that were very close to the regime and helped self-perpetuating the political system, to something that is new, what I would call the new Arab capitalism or capitalism 2.0 in the Arab world. 3 is what are the social, responsibilities for each party? Where is the new social contract? Where is the role of the state in providing social services? What is the role of the various communities, be it political or religious communities? Should they continue doing the job that in the past was not done by the state? And hence, what is their role in providing social services? How to allow the tripartite dialogue, be it the business community, the labor, and the state, to take place in a modern way. How to give more room for the youth and the women. And I would conclude by saying that those are, in fact, the horizons for the Arab world. Women are very well educated compared to maybe the common perception, and therefore bringing more of women in the economic cycle will boost growth. Demographics, if played right, would be one of the boosters of growth in the Arab world. Building the new middle class by bringing up those who are below the poverty belt up, like it was done in many emerging countries, would also in itself create growth. Those are ideas that we need, all of us, and especially people like you who are in fact thinking about the future and how we can translate aspirations into achievements, need to think of. And I think this is where the discussion should take place today. Definitely the transition is taking place. It will go through ups and downs, but it's happening. I think what is important today is to look at the futures 5 or 10 years from now and see how it's going to be shaped and how the actions of today, in fact, will bring the results of the future.
Very good.
And I believe in this future. Thanks.
Thank you, Jihad. I think if I can caricature a little bit, you say there's no fear of a meltdown. On the other hand, a new vision is needed to take advantage of the many assets and opportunities, and we can talk more about that. So in a way, this is one perhaps scenario to put up there. The reconstitution of new Arab capitalism and a social contract is a medium-term possibilities. If I can caricature your position, Jalloul, you're saying governments now have are compelled to act. There are demands from below and new political circumstances that create space, and the excellent example of democratizing credit. And so things may happen, could happen in the short term as well. I'd like to hear from Palestine. Samir, how do you see these two models, or do you have a third to present in terms of the regime in which we are and what it means for economic policy?
Thank you, Sahab, and thank you for the invitation. I think the magnitude of what happened in the Arab world will reach the person at the end of the day. It's not about the system or the structure. It's not about government and who rules. It's not about parties only. Ultimately, it will change each of us in a certain way in his relationship to the other, not just per person, but I'm referring more to the private sector. Only as an example, you're talking about the citizens. We are part of this citizenship. And how did we perceive the change that happened? Were we frightened? Were we inspired? And where are we going from what's happening? Although the Arab Spring per se did not reach Palestine, but it was at the doors. It was very close, and that's why we were very close watching what's happening and determining what role we should play in the coming context, not in the past one. Really, what's the role of the private sector in any community, in any society? And is it different from the role that you can play in the UK or in the US or in Sweden? Is it the same in growth economies? So can we redefine or define the role of private sector, of capitalism in that sense? in a third world country or in a growth country differently? Do we have different responsibilities? In general, we never thought of this. We thought it's always well known. What's our responsibility? First, we have to invest. And of course, we have to pay taxes. And for sure, we have to create new jobs and to reinvest if it's possible. Later, we were more soft and we thought we have to have proper jobs, not just jobs. So it was fine. And then we said we have to be socially responsible. So we have to have something like 1 or 2% of our profits distributed on social and other, I would say, tasks and responsibilities. This is basically what is expected from us in normal circumstances, I would say in the US or wherever. Is it enough for us in Palestine or in Egypt or in Tunisia? I'm telling you now that it was clear for us that this is not the case for a growth economy capitalism or a growth economy private sector. We realize that we have a different environment that dictates a different reaction from us and a different interaction with the government and with the public. And now is the time for us to define it more and to draw it properly with the partners, with the other groups that we are working within. And I'll say a few words about this. We were stunned by the depth of corruption that have characterized the regime in Egypt and in Tunisia vis-à-vis the private sector, and the relationship between the private investment and the governments in these two countries. Although we are private sector and we like to make profit, but we couldn't imagine that this relationship, when it comes to privatization and PPP, and even political parties activism and financing and so on, was that close in countries like in Egypt and Tunisia. We have never realized that this could be really a dangerous relationship, and this has to be revisited completely and to be rethought completely in all over the countries, in particular in growth countries. And I'll tell you why in particular, because of the difference in the growth between the social and political and the economic. The economic sector usually growth is very fast, while the social and educational and others are completely slow. They are more dominant by family, they are more dominant by old regimes, while the economic sector is more dominant by a modern regime. This dichotomy, this difference, should force us to bring something new and good to the society and to the community. However, linking it to the government, linking it to the authority, linking it to the parties in power in these countries means automatically that corruption is the name of the game, and could mean that we will have no role, no positive role to play, no independent role to play, and the only role we play is to get more money from our partnership with governments. That lesson is number one lesson that we have learned, and I think we need to rephrase, we need to restructure the relationship, and those who are involved in discussing and identifying what kind of partnership should be between government and private sector, again in PPP projects, for example, or in privatization projects, should rethink about the role of these two, in particular out of the experience that we have had in Egypt, Tunisia, and others. Mm-hmm. The second important lesson I have to admit is that we have realized that the social responsibility component, we were very active as a company in that component, feeling that in Palestine in particular the needy are more than any other country, and we thought being soft-hearted in a sense, paying more for the needs here and there would make us better. But I'm telling you, it doesn't add in changing the community, in changing the situation. We feel good that we are spending 2%, but we have to change our approach. How we can help the new partnership, the new citizenship means that we have to have a different partnership approach, not just with the government, but also with other citizens. And we have realized, for example, and I'll give you just a few examples. In education, in Palestine, the number of university graduates and number of enrolled in universities is much higher than the number in Israel. We are 4 million, Israel, they are 7 million. We have 230,000 university students in our universities, in 17 universities. In Israel, they have 180,000 students in 7 or 8 universities. However, what does it mean to have such a difference? Do you know that we have 55% of our graduates are women? 55. So they are mostly women. However, what's the unemployment rate in the country? It's around 24%. What's the unemployment rate between university graduates? It's 50%. What's the unemployment rate for women graduates? 60%. So what are we doing? We have women who are ready to be educated, ready to learn, ready to be active. However, educating them means killing them when it comes to finding a job opportunity. It's better for them not to learn in order to be employed. And this dichotomy needs to be solved. This is one issue that we have to work. I mean the private sector. I'm not referring to a government role. I'm seeing that we are responsible in creating better, not just job opportunities, but in linking university education and the workplace in a different way. We have done just a few weeks ago, we are having a major project to establish an interment city in Jericho in the Jordan Valley that will employ around 4,000 to 5,000 people. We have done a survey on university graduates and those enrolled in universities in Jericho area, which are around 2,500 people. Do you imagine that out of 2,500, we did not find a single university student or graduate who is specializing in tourism or in agriculture? And these are the two specialties that we are in particular in need in that area. It's an area where you have agriculture and tourism. But that means who's responsible for that and what's our role? All what I'm saying now is we are redefining our role, that it's our role to redirect the education that is there in the country and to play a major role in educating or in training or in alarming or in playing an important role as partners to universities, as partners to the graduates, in order to provide and to create a workmanship that is proper, ready for work. That's a new role that we are finding ourselves in, and I think this goes also beyond education. It goes to environment, it goes to health, it goes to social security. When we visited Gaza 2 years ago as an investors, when I've seen the problem of solid waste, for example, and sewage treatment, and the water quality, these are three basic issues that a government should provide. And of course, because of the Hamas-Fatah relationship and whatever, nobody is providing this properly. We thought that this is our role. We should start in solid waste recycling. We should start with sewage treatment, because you cannot enjoy a 5-star hotels in Gaza while 1.5 million people are dumped in that place with sewage and with saline water and so on. I'm not saying that out of a reaction to something. I'm saying that this is, as I see it, a new role for the private sector to play in a growth economies. We cannot ignore that particular part as we used to do before, because we did not realize that we are different. We are not a middle class in Europe. We are not a middle class in America. We are a middle class in somewhere that needs a lot of work and help to make it a better place.
Thank you, Samir. I think it's really interesting the way the puzzle is forming. Basically, you're putting yourself between these two positions and saying, and kind of an unshackled private sector, liberated from chronism, can play a big role of an engine in the future. So perhaps we can go back to you, Jalloul, on this issue. I mean, there are really two big challenges there. One is kind of the reconciliation with the private sector that has lost a lot of legitimacy due to the relation with the state in the past. And the second is the kind of social responsibility. Can the private sector actually rise to get organized in ways that kind of substitute for the state as the state is being reconstructed? Is this realistic?
Very good question. I was saying earlier that we're going through a transitional phase. Democracy goes first through a transition, then through another phase which is called consolidation. If you were to be successful in your consolidation stage, there is one condition that has to be met, which is setting forth conditions for prosperity to take place in the country. Because without prosperity, you're not going to be successful in your democratic consolidation process. It's obvious. if people at the end of the month they worry about feeding their children or how they're going to pay for their school. These are basic needs, and you have to provide for those basic needs so that the citizens, to use the expression that was used by Jihad, can feel comfortable to play their role as citizens. In other words, to play their civic role, to play their, to put their, you know, to play their contribution into building a better society, right? So, only when you reach a stage where prosperity consolidates democracy and democracy sets forth better conditions for prosperity to grow, that's when you may say that we are really on a path to prosperity, to welfare, and to a strong democratic process taking hold in the country. So the question then is, how do you create prosperity? Big question, right? And who should help in creating the prosperity, right? I often, when I talk to my audience, particularly my young audience, I start by titillating their minds and I ask them a simple question. We have a beautiful island in Tunisia called Jerba. Maybe some of you know about Jerba, Jerba la Douce. And so I ask them, what is the area of Jerba? Often they don't know. 500 square kilometers. Then I ask them another question. What is the area of Singapore? They don't know, right? So I tell them, 600 square kilometers. Now, what is the GDP of Singapore? $222 billion. I'm not going to ask you about the GDP of Jerba because it's insignificant. What is the GDP of Tunisia? 164,000 square kilometers. $50 billion. Now, isn't that something that one should pause and think of? Why is it that Singapore, that was much poorer than Tunisia 30 years ago, 40 years ago, let's say, with a few farmers and a port, was able to reach $222 billion of GDP? Do you know what that means? $222 billion is about half the GDP of the entire Maghreb. 5 million square kilometers, 100 million people, which is not even 30% of that of Spain. Now, isn't that something that would cause for us to think about? That's prosperity. That's one way to think of prosperity, the GDP of a country, per capita GDP. So let's go back to Tunisia. And then ask the question, to answer your question. I mean, I went about it a little different, but historically, since independence, it's the government that plays the leading role in everything. Something that was absolutely needed after independence. I mean, somebody had to start, right? And the government starts through a planning process, through playing a very important role in the public sector, running companies, very lousy management, but still somebody had to do it. 60 years later, are we witnessing the same situation? Should the government continue to play the same role as they did before? Quasi-monopolistic? The largest investor, the largest employer, the government has answers to everything. Providence state. And all the young people, in fact, they look to the government to give them answers. Does the government really have the means to provide those answers or to provide the needs that the young people of Tunisia, and really the same thing applies to the other countries? The answer is no. The budget of Tunisia is only $15 billion. And by the way, 60% of it goes to pay the salaries of the public employees, and some of it goes to social activities. And let me tell you something else. We pay in subsidies in Tunisia almost as much as we set forth for investment, for the investment budget. So in other words, we are in a situation where the government is spending almost as much on consumption as it is spending on investments. Do you really think you could really get something out of it? If the government were to just use the budget to reactivate the economy and really create employment? The answer is no. So then we have to pose the question, what's the solution? If the government does not have the budget for that, does that mean that the government cannot do anything? Not at all. Not at all. The government can and should do something, but something very different from what it has been doing so far. The government, in my estimation at least, should play a completely different role. Is the government poor? No. Why? Because the government has a huge portfolio of companies, of land, of all kinds of other assets, okay, that are more often than not badly managed. So then the real question is, how can we get something out of those assets and reinvest it into the society so that we could get something out of it? Now, do I trust the government to do that? Necessarily? maybe some governments, like the government of Singapore, did a great job. It's because they had a great leader, Lee Kuan Yew. He had a vision, he had a plan, he had a good economist, Dr. Goh, who they sat together one day and said, this is how we're going to run our country. And they have been extremely successful. You take a look at Tunisia, and I'm not critical, I'm just observing. Most of the public sector companies are losing money. The government doesn't know how to run companies necessarily. Some of those companies should stay as part of the government because they carry strategic activities. Many others don't. For example, why would the government keep in its portfolio the tobacco monopoly? First of all, it's bad for health, and then somebody else could run it much better. And you know how much would the tobacco monopoly sell for today in Tunisia? $1.4 billion. And you know how much the government is getting in terms of dividends from that asset which is sitting out there? Not much. So the government has the means. Now the question is, how can the government put those means smartly into use to create value added into the economy and into the society? And that's when I start answering your question. It can only do that if it enters into a true partnership, a smart partnership with the private sector. So my point is that the government should move from the situation where we are today, and we have been accumulating bad habits and bad traditions of the government trying to find answers to everything, trying to do everything, and having almost monopolistic attitude towards most of or at least the most important sectors of the economy, to a government which plays a completely different role, one where the government is a partner, where the government is an advisor, the government sets forth the proper conditions for the private sector to play a much more important role, the government being a co-investor with the private sector, which is something new, right? We mentioned PPP, yeah? What you should know is also the government can do social PPP, or PS2P, that's what they call it, for those of you who are interested. It's a new thing. Social PPP means that instead of having the government setting forth in its budget every year how much you're going to spend for rural roads and for hospitals and for this and for that, they will partner with the social operators to do it much smarter. I can assure you that for every dinar that we give to the civil society and to ask them to do the same thing, they will do a much better job than if the government were to do it. At least this is something that we have to think about. So this new role of the government as an initiator, as an advisor, as a partner, and as somebody who still has the commanding heights of the economy and of the social affairs, and of course political affairs of the country. So it's not more or less government, it's more government but much smarter government. Okay? Let me give you an example. I was talking earlier about the tobacco company, right? Let's say we do exactly what you suggested, that we privatize. If you say the word privatize in Tunisia today, you would have the unions holding you by the throat. They don't want to hear this word. When in fact, we can carry out privatization programs that are smart. For example, through a participative approach, where you give some shares to the employees themselves. It's one idea, okay? Once we pass that, we have the money. What are we going to do with the money? What the government has been doing so far is just allocating it back to the budget. That's bad spending. You take that money and you set up a fund, right? And you have a mother fund, and that's what we have been trying to do. You have to set up large investment vehicles with $1.5 billion, let's say $2 billion of a fund, right? For those of you who are a little bit familiar with private equity, through both leverage, the equity leverage and the debt leverage, you can cover investments of up to $5-6 billion dollars. Okay, do you know how many jobs that can be created there? Does the government need to make those investments? No. What I would do is I would set up some sub-funds. Let's say I would choose 2 or 3 sectors of the economy that are important to the economy. I would choose those sectors that have a propensity to create more jobs, because that's the issue today, right? And I would invite other investors to come in. So I'll put the seed money in the fund as government, and I will invite other investors who would come in. Why? Because they will find a professional vehicle in which to invest. We were talking earlier this morning about investments coming out of the Gulf. Why is it that investments are not coming out of the Gulf as much as one would hope to see I mean, considering the huge capital surplus that they have. Well, you know why? It's because historically, it's government to government. It doesn't happen that way. If you have a professional structure, a professional vehicle, in which the investors from the Gulf or from other areas would come in and they would find a professional investment management vehicle that they trust and that will manage their money in a professional way, then they will come in. Okay. So to go back to our example, we start with the seed money coming out of that privatization. Only one, right? $2 billion, let's say. You attract through the sub-funds another $2 billion, so the government will keep only 50%. That's $4 billion. That's up to 100,000 jobs that you can create if you do it smartly. So this is just an example of what the government can do by simply changing the way it runs the business and the way it looks at the economy. The backbone is investments.
Could you say one word about reconciliation, settlements with the private sector, transactional settlements?
Well,
the private sector is suspect right now.
The problem, the policy, that I'm presenting here is to help generate a new class of entrepreneurs, but that takes time. So the question, I think that is your question, is how do you manage the relationship with the existing investors in the economy? And I think it was said earlier, a lot of these investors have had very special relationships with the regime. And in Tunisia, for example, we have 400 businessmen who cannot travel. It's terrible. These are businessmen after all. They know their field, they have been making investments, they've been creating jobs, they've been creating companies, but they can't travel. Okay? And so the solution that we have proposed, what the government is now, the solution that the government is pursuing, okay, is to set forth a new framework, which is called transitional justice framework, right? And use that transitional justice framework to settle with them, which I think is a very noble approach, but at the same time it takes a long time. And these people are scared, they can't travel, they don't know what's going to happen to them. Obviously they're not very excited to make new investments or to create new jobs, right? 400 businessmen, some of the top we have in the country. And so what we've suggested really, and we've suggested that from the very beginning, is what is called transactional settlement, right? And it shouldn't be that hard. In other words, if they took advantage of certain benefits from the previous regime, we should be able to identify that. And it's like taxes, right? They have to pay, right? To get back their freedom of action, their entrepreneurship, they will simply transact, okay? And if we've done that, I think those people would have been back making investments, creating jobs, and helping the economy move forward.
Thank you. Let's have two quick interventions and then open it up. But let's build on that. The way the discussion is going is towards the private sector. So really I'm left with two questions. One perhaps for you, Jihad, is what's kind of the minimal set of reforms that governments can do and should do? The low-hanging fruits that you see for the next year or two, are there 2-3 important reforms that you would recommend? And perhaps, Samir, if you want to build on that, on the re-legitimizing the private sector, what can be done to give them kind of a new legitimacy that can allow them to play the kind of role you're talking about?
Well, there are several initiatives that government could do. I will put them under one heading, which is governance. It's an issue that we have mentioned at several instances, but we didn't address. Governance is, I think, is where the new government and the new political leaders should emphasize their role. Democracy it's a kind of pyramid whereby the base are the popular vote that gives a mandate to the political elite in order to govern, and then the same base will review through a check and balance system the performance. For decades, in fact, because of non-democratic regimes, we reversed the pyramid. I think the role today is to bring it back to what it should be, large base, democratic in nature, through elections, and through a system of responsibility and accountability. And therefore, where the government and the new governments or political elite should work is on increasing accountability. And increasing accountability is by shifting performance measurement from being an input-driven to become an output-driven. We took some note of some indicators about how much money the government is spending on education, health, etc. The right indicators are what is the outcome of the policies being implemented in terms of education, health. And this is, in fact, where you can measure success and failure. Therefore, one is to look at output, or, well, outcome is more difficult, but at least at output base, and hence change the accountability framework. Second is to get beyond phase one. In many of those countries, if you go back to the last decade, several reforms were initiated. PPP, or private sector involvement through privatization, was presented as a main solution to create jobs, address social issues, and improve social services or government services. But in many of those countries, when you analyze the reform track, you see that, in fact, we didn't go beyond phase one. And I think it's very important to put things into a long-term transformational approach. And this is where credibility, in fact, is, and where a change will last. And therefore, I think the approach that we need to have is about the political economy of reforms. And if you want me to list some of the initiatives, definitely one is a better definition of the role of the state and a better accountability framework, whereby the state has to provide citizens with the right information on the government actions, not only financial information, provide also with the right platform for debating policies, and hence provide information on not only what the policies are about, but what are going to be the side effect of those policies. We mentioned the issue of subsidy reform. It's very difficult to retain political influence and remove subsidy reform, especially now those governments need to get re-elected, and therefore the tendency is to keep on providing subsidies that are short-term solutions that will weaken the system instead of addressing social issues. And therefore, I think this is where the government should act. Second, there are some long-lasting human development, social development reforms. We mentioned education. I think this is something that should get an utmost attention, but not in the way we used to address it by putting more money, developing more schools. It's really to go to where the issues are and how to address them. 3 is to have a right division of labor. I like very much the fact that that the private sector today is looking at its role not only as a corporate social responsibility, but also at developing its own capital, which is the human capital, and look at it not as doing something socially good, but doing something that is economically good. And I think this is the new approach that one could develop. Last but not the least, there are some critical issues there is great importance in keeping economic and financial stability. All what we're talking about will not materialize if we have hyperinflation or if we have a public finance situation that would require the state to crowd out financing or to increase interest rates. Therefore, I think also here, government should pay more attention to maintaining economic and macroeconomic stability. That is today is the pressing issue for most of those governments.
Great. Samir, as Samir gives his answers, if some of you want to, I see microphones here. You can also speak from your seats, but if you like, you can already go to the microphone, because we'll open it up after you, Samir.
Yes, I'll be short then. We need first the private sector to be ready. The readiness, the perception of what's happening, looking for answers, being ready to listen very well and to partner on different bases is important. And for the first time, I think the private sector will not act on an individual basis, because corruption usually is done on an individual basis. A company, a government, a company, a bureaucrat. However, we're talking about a communal role of the private sector that has to work out, again, this partnership and the basis for that partnership. I think there is a major role to be played by IFC, IMF, and World Bank on this context, because generally they have determined long time ago this kind of relationship. They have talked a lot in their literature on that relationship, and this needs to be revisited. And they need to have a role in what's happening. I have just to say maybe the final point. If we are a group that relates to the whole world faster than the government, and we are in direct relationship with the markets, and we are learning a lot every day, not just by education, by merely being an exporter and an importer and an investors and so on. If we have this knowledge base, we have to be an active partner in our community with the government and with the other public instruments to make sure that we all move together, not again as we used to do, having I wouldn't say something now about the Gulf, but having Al-Qaddafi with 40 years, 42 years of experience being a dictator, having nothing developed at the social and whatever level, and having then a company, a private sector company that is well modern and very much developed and having a lot of profits. This dichotomy in a country should not be there in our new Middle East. And that's where I think this new partnership has to be created. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's take your question. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is James Carsey. I'm a mid-career at the Kennedy School. Previously, I was advising governments in the Middle East on economic and institutional reform. My question is, the panel has raised a lot this question about governments wishing to remain in power as politicians or in those countries where revolution hasn't happened. But a lot of the things you talked about in terms of reform, so privatization, something that wasn't addressed, but making the terms of public service less attractive so young people want to go into private sector jobs. A number of these reforms are going to be very painful, removal of subsidies, etc., and will actually create more instability, which will either lead to governments being unelected or potentially create revolution in countries that haven't had revolution. How do you persuade governments to make those long-term adjustments, and what sorts of things can they do to mitigate the impact?
Very good. Who wants to take that?
Well, it's the chicken and egg, really. Or it's like trying to find a straight line on a circle sometimes. It's not easy because the question is, first of all, it is a question of prioritizing those reforms. So in a country such as Tunisia, for example, where the biggest problem today is the problem of unemployment, particularly amongst the young graduates, which is the numbers are really scary. The unemployment rate in the country is about 14-15%. Unemployment amongst graduates in the rural areas in the interior part of the country can go as high as 40%, which is very similar to what you were saying. So it's a real issue, okay, and you have to give them hope, okay? And so the way to go about it, in my estimation, is that we know the problems cannot be solved overnight. Okay, you have to set forth your priorities, but you have to do something today to gain that political stability, to gain political stability, you have to gain some social stability, right? The only way you can go about it in the short term is what I call managing expectations. If you tell somebody I'm going to build a highway between Tunis and, let's say, the city of Kef in Tunisia, okay, they'll say, oh, well, we've heard it all before, and you've been saying that for the last 30 years. But if you start building it, that's managing expectation, because they would expect that within 3 years or 4 years, that highway will be built, and with it, you create the conditions for SMEs to grow or to be created or whatever. Highways are very important because you help the farmers, sell their produce and in the neighboring city much faster than they did, etc., etc. So you have to go about it in a smart way and prioritizing your reforms. I mentioned to you 2 reforms that we were able to do in a transitional government in that very short period that we've had, that small window of opportunity, that we were able to do. Microfinance to help create jobs in the rural areas. My objective is that from 500,000 credits that we've given out so far, I want to double that to 1 million. Okay, and I'll tell you, I met some of the ladies who are beneficiaries of these credits, of these microcredits. It's amazing the transformation and what you can bring to these people. You bring them hope. Simple reform, simple action, can be done quickly. It can be implemented quickly. Creating the capital markets for SMEs is another one, because if a young entrepreneur has $500,000 and you give him access to raise another $500,000, then his project will go from $1.5 million dinars to 3 million dinars. The number of jobs will be doubled, etc., etc. So that's what I mean by priority. There are some short-term reforms that you can embark on doing while preparing the ground for the much longer and much more difficult reforms, such as the reform of the administration, the reform of the subsidy, the reform of the financial system, etc., etc. So you have to set forth the priorities, and you have to do it step by step. And yes, indeed, you have to be very careful not to put all of the reforms at the same time, ending up creating more problems than you're really solving.
I mean, clearly, the new political situation. The question is whether the new political situation creates opportunities for economic change. And I think what you're saying, Jalloul, is because governments know that they'll have to compete for elections in 4 or 5 years, is going to give them the guts to do what perhaps Ben Ali was afraid of doing, because he was afraid of the street. The government was weaker. But Jihad, maybe you can go in this direction. I mean, some of the stuff that needs reforming benefited the old elite in the past, and the system has shifted. I mean, we know that the subsidies go mostly, energy subsidies, to the rich. We know that credit was going mostly to a few firms, and so isn't there political space now to push the pains basically to those that have actually lost politically? And doesn't that create policy space, fiscal space for the new governments?
Well, 2 years ago, I was leading the work we were doing at Booz on the changing of role of government after the crisis. And almost 2 years ago, I was in Sydney in Australia during the elections. They were forming a new government, and I was watching the debate, and the debate was heated about how fast each of the 2 groups is going to reduce budget deficit and to reduce debt. And I asked the question, what is the level of debt in Australia? They said 14% of GDP. What is the level of deficit? It's 2% of GDP. But it's very interesting. They have created, since the crisis of the 80s, a culture internally whereby I think everybody was aligned to put pressure on the political elite and on the political parties to behave in a way to reduce budget deficit, and then to be very much on the savings side instead of being, on the expansionary side, which is usually political parties try to use in order to please public opinion. Therefore, I think the first is honesty, and this is something where You don't need political parties to do it. The intellectual, the economic, and the business elite, the media, should be honest about what is required in terms of reforms and what are the consequences of these reforms. This is one. Second is hope. We are, and I agree that we are falling in this trap. We're talking about reforms, about their pain, but we're not giving, enough attention to what is required in order to create jobs, and that what is the level of growth that you need to create, what type of investment you should do in order to have growth that generates jobs. And I think this is where the challenge is. We need to come up individually and collectively, not only to wait for political parties, because when you talk to them, they are still very much focused on the political transition, is what is a new economic paradigm that would create growth, would generate jobs, and then even if you do painful reforms, you can cover up with additional jobs, and then you don't need the state to be the employer of last resort. 3 is a fair distribution of the burden. Ishaq was mentioning the fact that, in the past, reforms were benefiting little, and those who were paying for it were the majority. Hence, you need to go back to the taxation system and to reform a tax system whereby you have more fair burden sharing, as well as also a new public finance model whereby the state distributes support where support needs. We took the example of subsidy. We changed the subsidy model to be more targeted based on mean testing formulas that are being applied all over the world or in many countries. We have, a long list of things we could do, but I think the name of the game here is a fair distribution of the share, and not to have the majority of those who don't have, pay the additional tribute for those who are going to get away from the effort. And hence, you need to go to the structural parts of the system, the taxation system, the way the government is functioning. Some of the things that we maybe didn't tackle sufficiently, but I still believe that hope and honesty are critical in creating the right mood for change.
Thank you. Let me take a few more questions. Let's take 2, 3. Over there. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We should start here. I'm gonna take like 3 or 4.
Thanks. Jed Schwartz, writer from Somerville. I'm in agreement with the idea that what you need to focus on is progressive taxation, not only of income, but possibly also of wealth. I don't know how the various wealth distributions are. I mean, in the United States, we have this 99-1% dichotomy that we talk about a lot. But I'm under the impression that there's a lot of inequality in most Arab countries, perhaps less so in Palestine, and perhaps less so in Tunisia. But in general, I agree that with this gentleman, Jihad, that this is a prerequisite, particularly given the erosion of the wage market, that's the labor market. That most market-driven wages are low, given the pressure from machines and the pressure from China and India. So it's urgent that there is a redistribution channel of going. Some of the money that the wealthy have needs to be attached by the state and funneled into the system. And the urgency is that over your shoulder, the radical Islamists, if I may use the term, are looking and waiting for you to backslide, and they're looking to use the plight of the poor against you, and their methods are not democratic, their objectives are not democratic, And if you allow them to steal your thunder by making them more the friends of the poor than you are, then there's the grave danger that they will, that the public order will break down. There will be. You understand?
Okay. Thank you. No, it's very well taken. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for these three complementary and very insightful visions of the region. In practice, in the countries that are going through transitions, it seems like those who are now in government and who are likely to stay in government for the 5 next year have agendas that do not go exactly in that directions. So I was wondering, in that framework, how can we enhance that change? What would be the institutions that can have a positive role in enhancing the change?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hamid Ashrain, I'm a research fellow at the Kennedy School. Thank you very much. I agree with a lot of what you said, most notably that the answer very much lies with the small private sector. We would love to see an equity fund happening for SMEs, but I don't think that's happening anytime soon. But I have two quick comments. One, you hint at that role of international institutions and the rest of the world. And I think that a lot of people put too much emphasis on the good that the rest of the world can bring, but I really think that over the past year and a half, most of the international goodwill has been squandered, and therefore there's not much happening. The African Development Bank hasn't put a dime in Egypt this year. The Global Partnership is...
Get to the point.
There's nothing happening there. I would love to see how we can, shift the perception in those countries to more bootstrapping than relying on the rest of the world. And the second quick comment is, particularly in Egypt, we are witnessing the replacement of a kleptocratic private sector connected to the government with seemingly the emergence of a new elite of the private sector that are also connected to the new government. But what can be done in terms of governance for the private sector in North African countries?
Thank you. Very good question.
Thank you very much. I'm Assistant Undersecretary here at Belfer Center. My question is going to, whenever I see a banker in the politics, they call me Marxism. That's, it's not economic at all. In the absence of any meaningful leftist approach, leftist movement, then we have a role for Islamic parties, Islamic movements. And to what extent Islamic extremism can utilize current situation for its benefit. And by that, in the condition of a very weak political party system, in the body politics of the region, the whole region, I can say, how can a citizen-centered approach can be work here, as we can see the protectionism versus democracy? How can we balance a sort of approach to mend this social contract, as you mentioned, to the extent that private sector can flourish, and by that I mean government can work as a servant, not a master, because we are talking about the rentier state, that rentier state produces rentier mentality, that in rentier mentality you have lost the value of work. Actually, work is valued for relationship, a particular relationship of individual, as it is mentioned, the corruption of center of the corruption in the region. It is because of the particular relationship between individual and public sector. How can we change this process to the
Thank you. I'm just going to take a last comment, or question rather.
Thank you very much. My name is Isra. I'm the Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences. So you mentioned on the role of private sector, government cooperation, and you mentioned on the role of confidence building. These are all, necessary. My question is about this transition period. Transition is a difficult task, including a lot of fighting between the consolidators and the innovators. And I'm from Turkey. I would like to give you a couple of examples, because at some point, innovators may try to create different types of extractive institutional structures. So Turkey has been doing frankly well since 2002. And I think you might be greeting just and working parties' economic programs. But for instance, in terms of private sector government cooperation, public procurement process as well used by the government to create new business elites. But this happened via 28 amendments to the public procurement law since 2002. And this was a hot topic of...
So it takes time, you mean? It takes time.
It takes time.
Yeah, but
yeah.
Can you try to get...
Okay, and so, okay, let's make it like, how do you think the retrogression can be impeded? The retrogression. I mean, the innovators creating different type of extractive, authoritarian institutional structures.
Very good.
Once when they...
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's go back to our panelists. We have a few minutes left, so kind of pick your question. I think they're a great question in terms of putting on the table really the main tensions, redistributive tensions needed to compete against other forces, yet governments unable to do it. It takes time. What is going to drive? What's going to be the driver of change?
Let me answer the first question, which I think is a very important question in terms of the redistribution of wealth. And the gentleman was saying that one way you do that is by rethinking your tax strategy, and you're absolutely right. Obviously, the situation is different in different countries. In Tunisia, you said so, and I think you're absolutely right. It means that you're well informed. We have a much larger middle class in Tunisia than is the case, for example, in Morocco. But in both countries, if we already are successful in avoiding tax evasion, we will be much better off than if we were to start to think about taxing the wealthy. Okay, because by taxing the wealthy, you're in fact pushing them to either to send their money outside the country, capital flight, or they will simply find ways not to pay. I think that there is a serious need for a very comprehensive tax reform in most of our countries that will lead us towards your objective, which is to make sure that people pay for what they're supposed to pay. I can give you so many examples, throughout the Maghreb, maybe in Morocco and Tunisia, where if people were to pay whatever they're supposed to pay, okay, the government would be collecting a lot more taxes than it is today, right? And your comment about having that proper distribution of income, alleviating some of the more needy citizens, the poor tranches, I think is absolutely correct. And you're absolutely right when you say, when you said that Islamism has been growing out of poverty and out of needs and out of basic necessities of the citizens. And this goes back to your observation. We've got to do something about that. And that's why I think the priority, while we talk about all of these grand ideas about how we can restructure the economy, what is the new role of the government or whatever, we should tackle immediately some of the burning priorities for the country, which is basically reducing poverty, giving a much better chance to the people, particularly in the interior of the country. In Tunisia, that's where the revolution started. I mean, we haven't seen much really in terms of revolts in the coastal areas because they are much better off, right? So we've got to have to focus on that, and the priority has to go towards developing programs to alleviate the pain of those citizens. Otherwise, Islamism will continue to grow in those areas, and that's where they are the strongest today. So now, whether we could say that Islamism equates with or is tied to poverty, or should Islamism, or whether Islamism will not also align its interests with the citizens who are better off, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because what we've seen in Tunisia is that the business community got very close to the Islamic Party, or to the Islamist Party. Okay, usually they work with whoever party is in power, and they always find ways to get close to them. And I can tell you that some of the larger groups have some sympathy with the Islamist groups simply because they want to protect their interests. Okay, so we really have to distinguish those two things. Okay, poor people are very much in favor of the Nahda in Tunisia because they have promised them that they will find them jobs. They've been giving them gifts. They've been doing all kinds of gestures towards them so that they gain their electoral support. Okay, we haven't seen them doing much to them after that. So now people are thinking, because particularly in Tunisia, the citizens are usually educated and they can tell right from wrong. And now they are demanding results, and they're demanding actions, which they're not getting, which would suggest that the next elections, it's not for sure that Nahda would be winning, at least would be winning at the same level as they did in the first elections. In fact, surveys seem to indicate that they're losing ground. Okay, citizens should judge governments by their actions and by their results and by what they feel themselves, whether they feel better off or not. Right? Those are the real issues today. And really, your question about the transitional government is a very delicate question, because even if you have a very strong government, very competent people, great level of expertise, great level of competencies, or no experience, obviously, because they're all new, right? Then whether they would have the latitude to carry out the policies that would really help address those issues in a transitional period, very difficult, because what they have in mind day in and day out is they have to answer to their political leaders, to their party, and therefore they almost find, even if they don't want to, they found themselves compelled to align themselves with their party lines. I mean, with the party with the party policies and objectives, and henceforth they would be thinking more about the next elections than they'd be thinking about carrying out whatever is necessary to address the immediate needs of the people.
We're running out of time. Jihad, very quickly, citizens will drive change?
Oh, yes, sure. I think, there are three things that are very important that emerged from the various questions. We have to accept that the transition is going to be a long-term process. And during this process, we are going to see ups and downs. Definitely some countries like Tunisia will be the lab for this transformation because of the nature of Tunisia, and also because of the ability of the Tunisian system to address those issues. Therefore, we have to accept that it is a long process and we will be disappointed many times during this process. Second, credibility, I think, is very important. Credibility of change comes with rule of law, judicial reform, culture of performance, and culture of accountability, and citizen to be aware of that. In this part of the world, people consider that the role of government is to address political issues and not to deal with economic policies. I.e., the way they see government playing in the economy is by redistributing or by providing support and subsidy. While I think we need to reposition the way we measure the performance of government in their ability to address economic issues. The lady here mentioned Turkey in 2002. I think few of us would have bet on Turkey that was near bankruptcy at the time, and saying that you will be having after the election an Islamic party going to power, and then hence 10 years after to see Turkey being one of the best performing emerging markets. Therefore, I think credibility is an important factor. The last point is we have a lot of strengths, and maybe we didn't have enough time to mention them. There is an emergence of middle class in this part of the world, okay? And what this Arab Spring brought freedom. People now, they aspire, and aspiring is the first step to moving. we have a very strong diaspora that is placed in countries that are leading growth in the world, Latin America, Africa, and in some Asian countries. Therefore, a smart formula of linking the country to its network within itself bring a lot. Positive demographics, be it in the place of women and their level of education, or on the youth issues. Many European countries are considering now repositioning some of their activities and moving them to the Middle East because of those factors. Therefore, I think we need to list our strengths, see how we can translate them into growth, points of growth, and how these points of growth will translate into jobs, and what does it require in terms of enablers, and how much it's going to open the floor for investors to come and feed the system with funds in order to do so.
Really?
Therefore, I think, if we accept that it is long, it requires credibility, but we have some strong points, if we don't look at it from this way, we will be missing the picture.
Thank you. Samir, your last thought. I know you have something to say, but I want to know how to avoid populism
Only.
in the coming period.
Look, what happened in the region was not led by parties with a vision. There was no vision. Change was the request of all. This meant for us that the new vision that is dictating the change in the region is not there yet. The dust basically did not settle yet, which means that the role of our dialogue, our discussion, the public debate that we're having now, within parties or within organizations or within citizens, is what will define the new vision of the new order in the Middle East, I would say. We had an experience in Gaza with Hamas, and it failed as a government. They succeeded as an organization, but they couldn't govern. They don't know how to govern till now, after 5 years. The ones in Egypt may manage, succeed. Let's see. And let's see how they will learn, because the Turks have learned these lessons the hard way. And they have found their way out, how to be modern, integrating into the world, and to be still Islamist. We did not find this option yet, neither in Egypt nor Tunisia, nowhere else. So the new party per se, that is both Islamist and modern in a sense, that will redefine the role of the Middle East, is not there. And the vision is what we're talking about all. That's what I think, that's what gives us the hope. We as citizens should not accept what the new leadership or the new governments will tell us, as we used to. We are not anymore dealing with Gaddafi, Mubarak, and Ben Ali. These are different regimes, we are different citizens. We are, after the Arab Spring, different people. And that's what matters. So we have to believe that we are able to change, we are able to speak, we are able to organize, and we are able, hopefully, to redefine a new vision for ourselves in the future.
Well, thank you. I thought this was a very interesting journey. I mean, we started somewhere, we ended somewhere, and it was a journey of self-discovery. And I think that it is exactly the kind of thing that needs to be happening now. It's basically, you said it, the future, the development is about self-discovery, and there is space for self-discovery. There are obviously risks ahead, but I think we've heard you talk much more about the emergence of this new capitalism bottom-up, by forces that are out there that are going to be interacting and are interacting already with each other. So I want to simply conclude by thanking our speakers that came from very far to be with us. So give them a big applause. Thanks for being here.